Please join me to welcome our presenters, Liesl and Adam, and enjoy today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilla, and good evening to everyone who's joined us on this webinar. Adam and I are delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about Itfm in a somewhat different forum than we had planned. Initially, we were going to be meeting at the Hyatt Hotel in Canberra. With things as they are globally, we've moved to our first ever webinar seminar, so bear with us. Let's hope the technology holds up this week. When you signed up, you would have seen a copy of the agenda for today. We are going to keep pretty much to those talking points with a focus on the public sector, given that Adam and I are both active in the Canberra market. That being said, there certainly is relevance and applicability to the private sector. So certainly you're not going to come away with only a government-centric view of Itfm. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about the importance of Itfm in the public sector and give you a couple of numbers about how much is actually being spent each year in the government sector, and we're talking federal only, and why it is so difficult to manage IT spend. We'll then jump in and look at some of the key attributes of an Itfm Itfm capability that's mature, and then Adam's going to share with you some experience from a client in government who actually did an Itfm maturity assessment and had great benefits from having a really good idea of where they were and where they were aiming for. We'll then wrap up with some examples from other jurisdictions, what other public sectors or government sectors are doing in the TBM space and in Itfm in general. And we've got enough time at the end for 15 minutes of Q&A, so please take notes as you go. If there are any questions, we'll do our best to answer them. Adam and I have agreed we're going to keep this quite informal. I don't think anyone wants to listen to 40 minutes of being talked to. So yeah, Adam, feel free to join me at any time and we'll hopefully make this a bit more of a conversation than a lecture.
Thank you, Liesl. I'd just like to also say welcome to everybody. Obviously, it's interesting times at the moment, but we do intend to share our experiences and our knowledge as best we can to give you a bit of a broader sense of some of the challenges, as Liesl's outlined, facing IT organisations, particularly in the financial management space in the public sector. And as Liesl indicated, some practical approaches to how to deal with that going forward. So as Liesl indicated, we will have a Q&A session towards the end. So we ask that you be patient. We will come back and seek to answer as many questions as we can.
Thanks, Adam. So moving on, why is Itfm so important in the public sector? This is probably one of my favourite cartoons, probably a scene everyone recognised. The cost analysis is really nice, but really what people worry about at the end of the day is when their email is going to work. So what is Itfm? In the simplest economic terms, it's about managing supply and demand to maximise the value of an IT organisation's portfolio. Like any form of financial management, it requires effective accounting, effective planning, and oversight of the IT spend to ensure that you're getting most bang for your buck or the most value from your IT investment. It involves managing your run the business costs in the most efficient manner to make way for spend on activities to grow or transform the IT business. But why is it so difficult? If we look back over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a huge change in the business of IT. What was once seen as the back office function, where some with techies who put clunky boxes on tables and plugged in cables, has changed dramatically. For many organisations, and the public sector is no exception to this, their business is technology. And this is increasingly important in the case of digital service delivery. And I think we've seen that in the last couple of weeks as many of us have moved to working from home. The technology has been absolutely integral in allowing us to do our jobs. And managing this requires a mix of skills. We're not just needing the conventional accountant who can balance the books, but we need people with enough skills to understand both finance and technology. Someone who can join the dots and draw the right conclusions so the right decisions are made. If we look at the public sector in particular, we see a significant amount of money being paid out from taxpayer coffers on IT. Digital transformation is the catchphrase of the day, and we see government with an increased focus on improving service delivery. We see agencies now being held accountable for how they spend those taxpayer dollars on IT, and that's no more apparent when you look at the high-profile IT project failures that make the front page of the papers. It's the last things that the government of the day wants. We want, if we're spending millions of dollars on an IT initiative, we want to be able to demonstrate to the citizens that we have delivered value for money. Again, in this day and age, there's the ongoing pressure for government agencies to do more with less. There's the efficiency dividend that agencies have to comply with each year. At the same time, they're also challenged with keeping up with a rapid pace of technology change. Technology that they had yesterday is no longer relevant today, and yet they still need to balance their checkbook at the end of the day. So how much does the federal government actually spend on IT? Well, the numbers are very rubbery. If you look at some of the key documents, we start back in financial year 11-12, Department of Finance issued the ICT Trends Report and reported a spend of around 5.9 billion. We've seen that number climb. That being said, there aren't any really up-to-date numbers. The most up-to-date number we've been able to find is from 2017, and that was the DTA ICT Procurement Task Force, which reported a federal government spend of $9 billion. Anecdotally, we're hearing in the market that that is now up to $12 billion. Looking at the three top publications that have come out in the last few years in federal government, there was the 2016 ICT Trends Report issued by the Department of Finance. And in that report, they talked about government non-corporate entities spending approximately 10% of their total departmental spend on ICT. There was an increased spend on outsourced providers. So 4 or 5 years ago, we saw that increasing from 20 to 28. We saw a split between run, grow, and transform the business of 78, 13, and 9%. And we saw roughly 37% of total ICT spend being on staff. My guess, given that document is 4 years out of date, we'll be seeing even more spend on outsourced providers, and certainly a bigger proportion of total departmental spend going on to IT. The following year, the DTA released their ICT Procurement Task Force report, and there were 4 key recommendations that came out of that one. Firstly was the adoption of a framework for ICT procurement that included ICT procurement policies. Second was the setting of annual targets for ICT procurement, with agencies required to provide an annual report to government articulating their contributions to achieving IT targets. There was also a recommendation to set up a comprehensive data set of government spend to allow greater analysis at a portfolio and project level. And lastly, the development of a public dashboard for significant ICT projects that will allow government and the public to see the status and the outcomes of ICT investment decisions. The last government publication in this space was issued by the ANAO. It was based on an analysis of data that had been published on AusTender, And in that study, they found that IT was the 4th largest procurement category in the Commonwealth. They also identified the 5 biggest spenders. Not surprisingly, we see the Department of Defence, Services Australia, Home Affairs, ATO, and the Department of Finance accounting for the biggest dollars in government. So what is government's digital agenda? I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Vision 2025 document that came out the year before last, which set the ambitious target of making all government services available via digital channels by 2025. There are 3 key points in that document. Government should be easy to deal with. Government should be informed by you, the citizen. And government needs to be fit for the digital age. But none of that comes cheap. And you can see there in their objectives in the document, they talk about supporting sustainable, shareable platforms across government and a focus on value for people and business to manage risks and costs. So with all of that in mind, where do we think IT spending is headed? So firstly, we see digital transformation still being front and foremost on the agenda in government, the focus on service delivery improvements, more and more outsourcing. We're seeing software as a service, platform as a service, everything is being offered as a service. And coupled with that, we're seeing an increased demand and use of cloud computing as more and more agencies look for that flexibility and the surge capacity that they need to cope with excess demand. The ICT transformation programs are going to continue as we digitise, and we're also going to see innovation continuing to be a buzzword with ongoing IT budget pressure for CIOs and CFOs to deliver more with less. So innovation is going to be critical to do that.
Sorry, Lisa, I think you'd also agree with me that that while we're focused on the public sector in terms of the introductory to date, I mean, these are similar issues that the private sector are facing as well. You know, there's been a rapid advent of technology innovation and transition to modern digital solutions. We can see with the current crisis at the moment that agencies, organisations across the globe are rapidly increasing their consumption of cloud-based services as a position to ensure that their workforce has the remote technology solutions and connectivity that they require to be able to continue operating and keep the economy moving forward. And I think in terms of ITFM and IT financial management, as you've outlined, Lisa, that's incredibly more important as IT becomes a major cost center within all organisations across the globe, ensuring that that spend is actively managed and that there is clear transparency on how well that spend is being invested to deliver the business outcomes and objectives is going to be even more crucial going forward.
Absolutely, Adam, and that's why that mix of skill sets of having people who understand finance but also understand the technology and can join the dots is becoming more and more important. They are very, very rare resources, and it's a continuing struggle out in the market to find people who can get both sides of the story. So that's a good segue into what a mature ITFM capability looks like. If we're going to continue with all this innovation, greater digitalisation, it's not going to come cheap, and we really need to be careful about what we spend, how we spend, and also how we demonstrate value for money. So if you were to have a Google and look at, well, how do I assess whether my organisation has got an ITFM capability that's fit for purpose, you'll probably come up with a number of different frameworks, but not a clear industry standard in terms of how we assess whether our organisation has got the skills it needs. You'll see a little bit of ITIL, they've got some financial management in there. The Technology Business Council has an overarching framework which looks holistically at optimising the value of an IT portfolio. A couple of other ones that you'll see, VMware had a tool that they used a few years ago. And what Synergy has done is we've taken these different models plus coupled it with our years of experience working in this space, and we've developed a framework that we've applied very successfully in a number of organisations to actually assess the maturity of an organisation's ITFM capability. And what we have looked at is 4 core dimensions: people, data, process and technology, along with 7 specific capabilities. And I'll go through this in more detail. And typically what we do is we'll go into an organisation and do a current state assessment using a series of very detailed questions and a 5-grade maturity scale to get a sense of where the organisation is at. And then we'll be looking together with the client to say, well, aspirationally, where do they want to be? Where do they need to be? And what should they be focusing on? We're realistic. You don't need to be an expert in every capability, but you certainly need to have a fair degree of competency across both the core dimensions and the capabilities. And you need to be clear about which of those capabilities are going to be the real levers for your organisation. So if I jump now to the core dimensions, these are really the foundational elements that an ITFM capability is built on. So we start with the people. Have we got people with the right skills and expertise? Is there a culture which values ITFM and an attitude of commitment to developing this as a discipline and capability? Is there sponsorship at the top? Is this on the CIO's agenda? And have we got the right development and training processes in place to upskill our resources who we want to be these ITFM experts? What we want is people who have the right skills and attitude and an organisational culture that prioritises ITFM. We move on then to the processes. So are there processes in place with clear roles and responsibilities defined to manage the different processes that are core to an ITFM capability? And you'll see in the next slide, when we look at the capabilities, you'll get an idea of just what type of processes we're talking about. The next dimension is technology. And there are a range of tool sets. And again, this is a case of not one size fitting all. There are a range of analytical tool sets. You could manage your ITFM, depending on your organisation, using an Excel toolkit. You may want to have something that's more advanced, for example, a tool like ClearCost or Aptio. So obviously we'll be looking at, does the organisation have the tool to do the analysis and the tracking that's necessary? Are these tools user-friendly? And what tools can be automated? We don't want to have people who are sitting, cutting and pasting, putting errors in data inadvertently. So that is one of the key things that we'd also consider. Last but not least is data. Obviously, you can only manage your finances effectively if you've got numbers that are relevant, reliable and accurate. And this is probably one of the trickiest elements of IT financial management. We sort of see 2 camps. Typically, you have the organisation who says, oh, we're not going to start with ITFM because our data isn't perfect. Let's get our data perfect. And I think all of you working in this field will know that day is probably never going to come. Then you've got the other side of the spectrum with organisations who say, absolutely no problem, we've got all that data. And when you actually start digging, you find that their CMDB hasn't been updated in 2 years. They don't have copies of all their software contracts. They haven't done a true up for years. And that makes the ability or the likelihood of being able to get meaningful data a lot more difficult. Adam, I don't know if you've got any experiences there on the data side that you want to share?
Look, I think, Lisa, like you've indicated, there is a situation where the data will be at various levels of maturity across all organisations. It comes back to, as you've outlined, ensuring that where it's relevant, where it's reliable and accurate, you make use of that information and utilise that data to build a strong focus on how the organisation can effectively manage its financial outcomes.
So those were the core dimensions. Let's move on now to the capabilities. And we've summarised these in our model into 7 different skill sets. The first one is the government's leadership and resourcing. So what we're looking for there in a mature organisation is commitment from the very top. Are the CFO and CIO on board? Do they think this is important? Are they prepared to invest time and resources to get their ITFM in place? Out of the US, we're seeing a lot of literature which talks about the CFO of IT. It isn't a term that has got much traction in Australia, but they're seeing the benefit of having a dedicated CFO just to manage the huge spend on IT. In this first capability, we also look at resource capacity, how are resources being managed, how are positions being filled, and are we getting the right people into the right positions. Moving around clockwise, the next capability we look at is planning, budgeting and forecasting, and to see whether or not those are all interlinked. Do we have a good demand forecasting mechanism? Is that translating into the planning that we're doing in the IT division? And is that being translated into budgeting? A number of organisations typically take last year's budget, apply a factor, plus or minus, and that's their new budget. And what we see in mature organisations is that they're actually looking at what the consumption is going, or demand for their services is going to be, and that is what informs their planning and budgeting processes. The next bit is the ITFM accounting. And there we look at the financial accounting. So when are we capitalising IT projects? What are we capitalising? How are we accounting for IT project spend? And importantly, asset accounting. And again, this is a specialised skill set. Everything needs to add up. And we need to have confidence that how we're accounting for our numbers is correct so we can make the right decisions. The next capability we look at is service costing. This is a topic that's been getting increasing focus in both the public and private sector. A lot of CIOs we talk to say they have no idea how much they are spending on IT. They don't know where they're spending it, and they don't know whether or not they're delivering value for money. If you ask a CIO, how much are you spending on data centers? How much does it cost you to service your end users? There are very few that can answer that question. And it could start with a very simple cost model, but it could also go all the way to doing full service costing, which you then show back to the consumers of those IT services, or the next step up is actually charging your internal and external customers for the IT services you provide. Coupled with that is benchmarking. So for example, there are a range of different IT benchmarking data sets that organisations can go and see, are they paying comparatively too much for their developers? Are they spending too much on security? Are they investing too little in grow or transform the business activities?
And I think that Lisa, service costing is an integral point for organisations to be able to build trusting relationships with their customers, to ensure that service costs are understood, that customers have a clear understanding of the full inclusion of service arrangements for that organisation, and that they can use that information to manage demand behaviours going forward.
Absolutely. So there certainly is an increased appetite for cost transparency. Culturally, this is a challenge for some organisations, particularly IT divisions where they've typically been able just to work a little bit in the dark. No one's really understood what they do or how much it costs. And so service costing can be quite a stretch for some organisations who aren't used to that level of transparency and accountability. Now, with the move to more and more outsourced arrangements, our fifth capability, contract and vendor management, is also one that seems to be a hot topic. This is everything from basic contract management capability. How do you manage contract performance? Are you tracking SLAs effectively? Are you managing vendor risks? And are you certain that you're actually getting value from the contracts that you've got? The last two capabilities, reporting and decision making, are inextricably linked. We need mechanisms to have effective performance management and reliable and timely reporting, because those capabilities feed into decision making and investment support. If we aren't performance managing and monitoring and reporting effectively, how will we know whether we're making the right decisions? And very importantly, how will we know whether or not we're making the right investment in IT into the future? So when we've gone through this exercise, what we typically leave with our clients is a simple pie chart, which has proven to be very powerful. Below the line, you'll see the 4 core dimensions. The darkly shaded areas represent the current state that the client's ITFM capability is in. And then together with the client, we'll work out, well, of those 4 core dimensions, which are the ones they should be focusing on, given the nature of their organisation. Now, every organisation will be difficult, and what we say to organisations that we work with is, you don't need to be everything to everyone. Work out which of those dimensions are going to serve you best, and certainly get a baseline level of capability across all 4 core dimensions. If we move above the line to the capabilities, again, the same concept. The dark orange areas show the organisation's current capability, and then together we'll sit down and say, of those 7 capabilities, which are the most important ones for you to excel at? If an organisation is heavily outsourced, you'll see in this case, they'll say aspirationally, they want to be leading in the area of contract and vendor management. For an IT organisation that's doing things largely in-house, you may see them focusing on service costing. If planning and budgeting is a black hole for them and they've had a lot of variances, actual to budget, they haven't been able to forecast their demand sufficiently, that could be an area they choose to focus on. But what we find with a simple tool like this, it really helps to target a client's focus on specific areas of improvement. And from that, we can sit down and develop a roadmap. They know where they are, they know where they want to go, and you can then work out the steps that they need to get there. Adam, would you like to take everyone through a case study where you've used this quite effectively? Is Adam there?
Thanks, Liesl. As Liesl has outlined, the current climate across government is focused on reducing waste, generating efficiency, and transiting towards a smaller, nimbler public sector. This in turn is placing more pressure on IT's ability to demonstrate value, justify costs, and to provide reliable cost transparency to support and influence this reform agenda. Budgetary pressures continue to abate IT's ability to associate IT spend with business value due to limitations with traditional financial taxonomies or chart of accounts. For example, traditional financial reports on hardware, software, labour spend by cost centre or project provides great insight into cost input, but does not provide context regarding activities that those cost inputs contributed and the services they support. Machinery of government in the public sector, like mergers and acquisitions in the private sector, can be a daunting task, and one that is more complicated should there not be a solid understanding of cost structures across services, technology platforms, and IT functions. These activities are not something the private sector, I'm sure, would be looking to engage on a frequent basis. That said, this is an activity that in the public sector is required to respond to frequently with agility and distinction, and let's say as frequently as every 3 years. The focus of this section is to outline a series of initiatives adopted by one particular client of ours, following a self-assessment on their IT financial management maturity and capability. It was in direct response to the challenges I've just outlined earlier. Our intent is to provide you with a practical appreciation of what are likely to be similar issues or challenges that you and your organisations face in its pursuit of effective financial IT management. To set the scene in context, in this particular example, our client had been through a significant period of change, resulting in the onboarding of several functions through various machinery of government changes over a very short period of time. The IT shop effectively doubled in staff and tripled in budget over an 18-month period, only to halve again some several years later. The elasticity of this change brought with it several key challenges, following loss of corporate knowledge, structured processes, and rapid change in scale and scope of service delivery. I have listed on the slide several initiatives that were stood up to place the IT group on a more sustainable budget footing following this period of rapid change. If we work clockwise and start with the internal budgeting process, the staff turnover resulted in unclear financial processes around budget development, revenue management, and capital investment. 3 initiatives were stood up to combat the challenges this lack of definition presented. These initiatives are oriented around the capabilities that Lisa outlined in terms of governance, Itfm accounting, decision-making, and investment support. A clear definition of internal budget processes was required to ensure consistent preparation and formulation of budget forecasts for internal and external budget outcomes. Revenue forecast guides were developed to ensure consistency in the accounting of Section 74 revenue, so this is revenue in the public sector context, of actual forecasts and actual costs across IT service delivery arrangements, and the effect of these revenues that they had on expense budget forecasts. Capital investment prioritisation framework was developed to ensure investment processes were measured against benefits, risks, contribution to departmental or agency objectives and outcomes, and obviously value and cost. If we move to the next point in terms of SAP data management, this client uses SAP as their base enterprise resource planning system. An absence of standardized cost structures impaired their ability to report performance. It also resulted in organic growth of several cost codes used for a multitude of purposes. In other words, they were used to project accounting module of their financial system to do different things for different purposes without any structure. A standardized set of cost codes was developed and enabled them to ensure that reporting could be done in a consistent and structured fashion. It allowed reporting of IT service delivery outcomes across key programs, customers, and service lines. Moving on, customer pricing. Inconsistent definition of services and costing pricing approaches, assumptions, inclusions, etc., led to confusion amongst their clients and anxiety where cost of components differ from service offer to service offer. Adopting a common, consistent, and therefore standardized set of policy and procedures endorsed by the central policy agency, the Department of Finance, quickly grew trust and confidence amongst their customers and key stakeholders such as the CFO. These initiatives obviously align to what Liesel's outlined in terms of the service costing capability. In terms of reporting, as I outlined in my opening remarks, the IT financial performance of this particular agency was essentially being summarised as a single cost centre level for executive leadership reporting. There was no clarity on the performance of business as usual operating spend versus IT project spend, nor that between service delivery within the organisation and that of service delivery to their external customers across the government. The complication here is that poor performance in one aspect, such as BAU deliverables, may likely be indicative of a longer term solution. However, the issue can be masked by that of short-term implications around project spend, where the issues are likely driven by delayed procurements or short-term measures, such as that of shifting project scope. Further, the IT service delivery performance for a service delivered internally can be masked by issues that are related solely to external service delivery arrangements to revenue-based customers. Expanding executive reporting to illustrate the different domains of IT spend enabled this client to educate and provide awareness to the executive leadership team of where the issues in terms of financial performance arrested, to better understand short-term issues versus longer-term issues, and thus positioning the executive team to better respond and support the CIO. In terms of system-based tools, absence of system-based tools for IT financial management can hinder productivity or impair the confidence of financial reporting due to the absent risk of human error and Excel. System-based tools do not solve problems in their own right. They simply increase productivity and assurance when used appropriately. In terms of front door costing processes, expanding on initiatives around customer pricing, consistent and aligned front door processes ensured that satisfaction and trust was built with their customers. To ensure that customers can effectively manage consumption, they need to have a clear understanding of the service inclusions, service pricing, what is chargeable, what is not, and whether purchasing decisions result in acquisitions of assets or simply seen as a maintenance activity. Clarity of pricing for the customer builds satisfaction and trust that they have a thorough understanding of what they're paying for. Additional initiatives that resulted from this particular maturity assessment resulted in the agency's ability to stand up a baseline budget for all service arrangements across all internal and external clients. This was pivotal to ensure that the annual budgeting process was centralised around value to business and not the cost of IT. This comes back to the point of IT being a stigma or a black hole. So it's transitioning the focus by building a clear understanding of the cost of service delivery to focusing on the value that IT provides the organisation. Essentially, the client was able to position itself from being a value centre as opposed to a balancing item in the budget process. Decisions around IT consumption and therefore IT forecast expenditure was driven by their customers based on affordability, prioritisation and value decisions. The ability to present shareback reporting on an ongoing basis enabled the conversation and dialogue between customers and IT and the CFO to continue beyond the annual budget cycle and be integrated as a business as usual process, thereby ensuring future budget cycles operated in a more sustainable, structured and efficient manner. This extended to the ability to readily conduct benchmarking IT spend, further assuring the organisation where efficiencies or inefficiencies existed across IT financial performance and to jointly tackle those areas with customers. By adopting these initiatives and undertaking the benchmarking process, there were several optimisation initiatives that were driven as a result of benchmarking recommendations. I've outlined what they are on the slide. Essentially, this particular client of ours were able to achieve $10 million in tangible savings within a 12-month period by adopting these maturity initiatives and the benchmark recommendations outlined. This outcome is a testament to the value that a structured, considered IT financial management framework can deliver to the IT shop of any organisation. On the next slide, I've outlined from a service costing and service model perspective, some of the key challenges that IT organisations face, in particular to dealing with rapid elasticity, rapid change in demand and rapid change in scope. I won't go into this in too much detail. I just wanted to put it on the screen and give you an idea of the challenges that the public sector is facing. I'm sure they're very similar in terms of the private sector challenges and some of the solutions that our clients are looking to deploy in order to address these challenges. You'll find that from a service costing and service model perspective, a number of these solutions are underpinned by such a capability to provide greater transparency and understanding of IT costs, to have a clear baseline budget for IT expenditure across the organisation, to have a clear understanding of what functions are insourced and outsourced, to underpin the workforce planning and capability decisions across the organisation, and to support investment planning and forward roadmaps in terms of IT expenditure. I'll pass back to you, Lisa, to continue with the next section.
Thanks, Adam. So that will give you an idea of what it may look like for an Australian government client. It's always interesting to look a little bit broader than our borders and see what lessons can we pick up from other jurisdictions. And probably if we look at whole of government IT financial management, where we see probably the most proactive approach is actually out of the US. Now, the US federal government spends approximately $90 billion each year on IT. So if you factor in the exchange rate differential, that's more than 10 times what the Australian federal government spends. And their journey started way back in 1996 with the Klinger-Cohen Act, which included two pieces of legislation to establish a comprehensive approach for executive agencies to improve their acquisition and management of IT resources. There were three areas they focused on. Firstly, it was on information resource planning to support their strategic objectives. Secondly, it was a focus on capital planning and investment control to link their budgets to the execution and their outcomes. And lastly, and probably most importantly, it was rethinking and restructuring the work they did before they made an investment. So the situation in the US was quite different to what we've had in Australia, in that all IT procurement was administered by a central agency, GSA, the General Services Administration, instead of divesting that down to the individual CEIOs. And it was generally accepted by federal executives that they knew they could do a better job of managing their spend with increased visibility and accurate data. And that pressure was coming from the taxpayers, from the citizens who were wanting more visibility and accountability for how their taxpayer dollars were being spent. As I mentioned, this started back in 1996, and they've been working on it since then. But if you look at their 2018 budget and how they were categorising IT spend, 84% was still tagged in the other bucket, making it very difficult to establish a baseline for federal investments and to show whether or not citizens were getting bang for their taxpayer dollar. So if we look at the next slide, which shows the journey that they've been on, as I mentioned, they started with the Klinger-Cohen Act. It went a bit quiet until 2009, which saw the introduction of the IT dashboard. Now, this was part of Obama's campaign to cut waste, where he was actively hunting down opportunities to eliminate misspent tax dollars. I really recommend you make a note of this, the dashboard address, and if you've got time after the session, pop into that site and have a look at the type of information that the US government is making transparent through the portal. You can choose any government agency. You can go and see what projects have they got underway in the IT space. What's the spend? Are they tracking according to plan? Are they delivering within or beyond budget? And that's made it really difficult for underperforming projects to go under the radar, and certainly has changed the behaviour of a lot of federal agencies in terms of how they manage their projects, because they know they are going to be accountable in the public domain. In addition to the Klinger-Cohen Act, there was another act, the FITARA Act, which is the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act, which was a significant reform in the US. And what that piece of legislation required federal agencies to do is actually implement improved governance and processes to improve that cost transparency. That was followed shortly thereafter by the IT Cost Commission report, which was a joint initiative between private sector IT domain experts and their federal agency CIO counterparts. So there, the COST acronym stands for Cost, Opportunity, Strategy and Transparency. And the findings from that commission were released in 2016 in the IT Cost Commission report. And again, that's something you can Google and have a read through if you're interested. And that report actually outlined the best practices and recommendations for the federal government to improve agency spend on IT. The CPIC, which is the capital planning and investment control process that was mentioned in the Klinger-Cohen Act, came to the fore again in 2017, and all government agencies were required to report their budget figures by IT towers and costs pools. That again was linked with an initiative in 2018 of Trump's presidential management agenda, which was setting a goal to improve outcomes through federal IT spend. And in the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more information on what that CAP 10 goal was, and more importantly, what progress is being made towards it. Now, that CAP goal also included technology business management. That's a term that some of you may or may not be familiar with. And what TBM really is, it's a collection of best practices on how to manage the business of IT. Again, a good website for you to look at is the tbmcouncil.org. You'll see that in one of the slides coming up shortly. That'll give you a little bit more of an overview of what TBM is and what the new acceptable industry standard is with managing IT portfolios. The US has also set a very ambitious goal that by 2022, every agency in the federal government space should have adopted TBM. And again, we'll talk about what that looks like in more in practice. So moving on to the next slide, the recommendations from the Cost Commission report. There are 4 key ones. Firstly, they recommended all federal agencies adopt a standard taxonomy, a standard model, and a standard system for managing IT costs, resources, and services. And what they're trying to achieve with this is get everyone speaking the same language, using the same terminology, so that they can compare apples with apples. So that is a fairly rigorous framework that they've adopted and tweaked for use in federal government to get all their agencies to measure, account, and report in the same manner. The Cost Commission report also recommended a standard set of metrics, again, so agencies can track their own performance, see whether or not they're cost effective, and benchmark with each other. So if we've got an agency that has got really low data center costs, let's start a dialogue to find out what they're doing. Have they got practices that we could adopt in our organization to be more efficient ourselves? They also recommended that each agency establish an office to manage the cost transparency, and that they invest in staffing this office with people with the right skills and the right attitude to actually bring about this change, encourage transparency, and drive through these reforms. The last recommendation was the establishment of a government-wide governance board to make sure that all agencies were embracing this change and moving closer to the 2022 goal of every federal agency having a TBM framework in place. So I mentioned earlier the CAP 10 goal. This actually comes out of the White House. A CAP is a cross-agency priority, and you can think of it as basically the wish list from the US president. It's issued by the Office of Management and Budget, and that is the entity that supports the US president in implementing whatever his vision is. So there are a number of goals, and CAP goal number 10 was looking at improving outcomes through increased transparency across federal agencies. And the goals or the objectives align very closely to the outcome of the Cost Commission report. They're looking at improved data accountability, better transparency, customer focus, so becoming more citizen-centric as we deliver digital services, and empowering the agency heads to really drive ahead with those reforms. So this goal specifies that each agency must use the methodology and data standards, and also requires a cross-agency framework so that everyone is counting their IT dollars and measuring and planning their IT spend in a consistent way. If we look at the next slide, you can see how the US government has actually crafted this framework. They've used an open source standard for IT costs that has been promulgated by the TBM Council. It's a framework that's validated, that uses validated best practices, and one that is accepted across both the private and public sector. And if you look at the objectives there, they are looking for better business, financial and purchasing outcomes. They're looking to demonstrate the efficiency of the investments. They're looking for streamlined reporting and the ability to benchmark to see, can I improve, who's doing it better than we are, and what information can we share so that collectively across the government we are more effective and making better use of taxpayer money. Now you'll see there I have included a link to the actual action plan for that CAP goal. I'm pretty sure the slides are going to be shared separately. So again, that is a site I can recommend if you are interested to go and look at in more detail. So in terms of how the US is going, here's a quick summary of where they're at in their journey. They've got 3 articulated strategies. One is to improve the granularity in their budget and spend reporting using the dashboard that I talked about earlier. And there they've reached the milestone already. The second strategy is looking at government-wide implementation of guidelines. There they're quite a bit along the journey. They've got cost pools set up that all agencies use. They've got data distributed to help agencies implement TBM. There's a TBM playbook. Again, all of this is open source. You can find it if you Google. Where they haven't got to quite where they wanted to be is looking at some of the cloud implications and the standardized service taxonomy. And I think that's probably going to be one of their biggest challenges because of the range of different services that government provides. How do they get everyone to articulate those services in a standard manner? In terms of their last strategic priority, which was adopting and implementing TBM across the agencies, they have also got a fair bit away along the journey. They're in the middle of phased implementation, and as we understand it, they are still on track to meet that goal of 2022 with all agencies on board. Adam, I don't know if you wanted to jump in with anything else from the US experience.
No, I think you've summed it up well, Liesl. So nothing more to add at this stage.
Excellent. Well, I see from the clock we've got a few minutes left for questions. Marilla, how would you like us to go through those? Marilla's not there. I'm just opening up the Q&A section. Got a question there from Christopher. What proportion of government IT spend is typically on staff? That's a really good question. Because here in Australia we don't have a consolidated IT reporting, we have to rely on those reports that I mentioned right in the beginning. And from memory, the Department of Finance report from 2016 had the ICT spend on personnel as being roughly 37% of ICT spend. What the spend on contractors is offhand, I don't know, but certainly around 37–40% on ICT personnel. The next question we have, Sid, is there an ISO standard for ITFM? Adam, would you have any knowledge about that?
Thanks, Liesl. No, I believe there's no ISO standard as such. As Liesl outlined earlier in the presentation, there's a number of different frameworks that look to